Hello everyone and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD and welcome to the final list for the 2024 list season, year-end season, whatever you want to say. The top 50 best albums of 2024. Kind of the big one here, kind of wrapping the whole thing up. So much good music this year. I even considered at one point doing a smaller list because 50 does seem like a lot, but it was just not going to happen with how many things I wanted to include. We're going to start it off here first with an entry that's not exactly going to be ranked in the list. That's going to be Godspeed You, Black Emperor, no title as of 13 February 2024, 28,340 dead. Due to the statement this album is so outwardly making, I failed to decide where to put it every time I went about ranking it on this list. Call this some sort of cognitive dissonance, if you will, but I found it a bit jarring to put a clear reference to arguably the most heinous thing happening in the world right now, right next to a bunch of albums that I just like the sound of and like listening to. It is great, of course, that they're spreading awareness there, though. The music on the album would have landed pretty high on the list if I were to find a spot to rank it. As for how it sounds, I like this the best out of anything the band has done since Alleluia, Don't Bend, Ascend, and I'd compare the sound of it most to Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. If you're familiar with Godspeed, there's not going to be a lot of new and exciting things to say about the music because it's basically just them back at it in the best way. If you're not familiar with Godspeed, but droning instrumental post-rock with a gorgeous, transcendent, and progressive edge sounds nice, this is absolutely a band to go become familiar with. So we're going to run this much like the songs list in that the first 30 I'm going to kind of try to just bust through as quickly as possible here, and then the top 20 will go into a little bit more detail as well as playing a clip so you can kind of sample it out for yourself a little more. At number 50 here we have Magdalena Bay, Imaginal Disc. When it's a hot take to put it this low on a best albums of the year list, you know it's an album that's a pretty special moment. While it never did it for me fully, the impressive elements and amazing songs here are undeniable. It's so easy to recognize both the immediate likability and innovative edge of tracks like Tunnel Vision or Death and Romance. Coming in at the number 49 spot, we have Shame by Meth. One of the darkest, heaviest, grittiest albums I've listened to all year. I'd say it's one of the best hardcore albums I've heard this year, but it ends up kind of transcending that entirely into more the territory of noise rock. It's challenging, destructive, and ultimately something pretty unique. Coming in at number 48, we've got Oxygen Destroyer, Guardian of the Universe. This isn't one that we talked about on the podcast, but it's a metal album that you should absolutely go check out if you're into metal at all. It's just a really fun listen all around. It's not necessarily doing something super brand new with any of it, but if you're looking for some new thrash or death metal to put on rotation, if that's what you're itching for, this is a great one to turn on from a little bit more of a lesser known band. At number 47, we have Cemetery, Bloody Angel. Haunted Mound's trajectory has been incredibly interesting to watch as a fan from the beginning, and currently it feels ridiculously hit or miss. One of those said hits is easily this Bloody Angel mixtape from the group's main member Cemetery. It often brings in the noisy distortion and campy horror-related lyrics from his earlier work, while striking a balance that's familiar to more recent projects like Butcher House and Sound. Number 46, we have Quadeca, Scrapyard. Quadeca's recent history has been incredible to look at, and with this newest entry, it just gets crazier. Scrapyard is presumably a collection of leftovers and B-sides, but manages to feel like more of a consistent and cohesive experience than most of the albums I hear despite that. This has Quadeca's most fun and accessible modern era tracks, such as Way Too Many Friends. That's then contrasted absolutely beautifully with songs like Guide Dog and You Tried That Thing Where You're Human that are more reminiscent of his recent masterpiece, I Didn't Mean to Haunt You. Number 45, we have Aurora, What Happened to the Heart. Aurora is an artist that I hadn't hopped on the train yet and listened to before, but this latest release really took my breath away and made me an immediate fan. In art pop and the fringes of poppier music, this is one of the most interesting and sonically unique listens of the year. Aurora proves to be a solid vocalist and lyricist, but the overall diversity and presentation of those qualities is where that gets driven home the most. Number 44, I'm giving it to Colin Stetson. The Love Love It Took to Leave You. Saxophonist Colin Stetson made something truly unique this year with this beautiful and eye-catching album. It's equal parts entrancing, relaxing, and harrowing to create a jazzy, ambient, unique listen. What's possibly the most impressive is just how much of this album is made up by saxophone playing, even though sometimes it sounds unlikely the instrument could make such sounds. Strike Your Forge, grin, go plug some headphones in, and take a listen to this one. Number 43, Turquoise Death Kaleidoscope. The previous album from Turquoise Death really blew me away, and while I'm not quite as hot on this one, I'd never call it a letdown. Atmospheric drum and bass is still the primary focus, just like as in Say Bueno, but the shoegaze subcategory is replaced with more of a vaporwave reminiscent edge. It's something I can liken to many more albums I've heard, but this experience is equally well made and impressive. Truly one of the best instrumental albums to come out this year. Here at number 42, we have Adrian Lanker, Bright Future. While I'm out of the loop on Big Thief for the most part, I decided to go ahead and check out the lead vocalist Adrian Lanker's solo album, and I did so to excellent results. As far as a simple folk album goes with a sad, emotional edge, checks all the boxes and then continues to go above and beyond. Some of the year's most simple but simultaneously hard-hitting songs land on here, and it's a great one to have a cathartic cry to. Number 41 brings us Vampire Weekend, Only God Was Above Us. Vampire Weekend's long-anticipated comeback was one that didn't disappoint against all odds. For years, the band's trajectory ended on a bit of an unfortunate note with the underwhelming album that was Father of the Bride. Even if this album ends up being the closing to Vampire Weekend's story, this blissful, immersive, wild, and psychedelic listen is a far better final chapter than we had before. Number 40, Mount Eerie, Night Palace. A less uncertain but equally anticipated comeback came this year from Phil Elverum, returning to the Mount Eerie pseudonym. This return is possibly the most lengthy and diverse album he's put out, and yet manages to feel like a cohesive experience. It doesn't match up to his very greatest works in my mind in terms of consistency, but the highest highs are impressively high. I'd like to go talk to a fish now, but unfortunately I have to finish the rest of the list first. Number 39, Gene Dawson, Glimmer of God. Gene Dawson's latest release here really feels like it came out of nowhere and did so with guns blazing. This feels like his best but also most ambitious album to date, even considering his dive into indie rock with Chaos Now. This album has pockets of everything from dark wave to indie pop and always sounds fantastic doing so. Number 38, Lineker, Caju. Brazilian R&B singer-songwriter Lineker exists within a bit of a blind spot for me, but this is new ground I'm incredibly glad I covered. This was one of my most revisited albums this summer for its easily listenable, fun, energetic, and near-perfect all-around vibes. On the cover, it looks like she's driving on a summer day with the windows down, and that's exactly what has proven to be endlessly rewarding when coming back to this album. Number 37, Trans Upper Egypt, No Dub. Of the underground album digging we did this year on the podcast, Trans Upper Egypt may very well be the strangest thing we found. This band has an incredibly unique sound. I'd describe it as jazz, post-rock, and industrial rock. The bass stands out super nice and crisp, which naturally makes me like it more, and the vocals contrast them nicely by being what my co-host described as sounding like the devil at the other end of a train tunnel offering you a cigarette and trying to sell you used cars. It's not something I can reasonably describe in a short period of time, but I fully recommend diving in headfirst into the uncanny valley with this one. Number 36, The Last Dinner Party, Prelude to Ecstasy. The Last Dinner Party have made a huge splash into the near overnight notoriety they have now with their gorgeous blend of glam rock. Industry plants or not, it's easily deserving based on the quality of their music. This whole record sounds stunning front to back and packs a great amount of depth and heart into the writing throughout it. Number 35, it's Freako, Where We've Been, Where We Go From Here. Another band that made a sudden rise to popularity is indie rockers Freako with this long-windedly titled album. Here we have everything that's always made indie rock work well as a genre paired with enormous, intense impact throughout. There's a bit of an underlying narrative and a strong bit of expression below the surface here too, but even just on the surface, the thing sounds so damn nice. Number 34, Malneezy, To Cause Harm. Malneezy is a pretty underground electronic producer. He's one of many artists who hold a similar place, but stands out so far among the rest of them that I've heard. Excluding a couple of vocal features, this album is almost entirely instrumental, and it is one of the most frightening and tense albums I can say that for. His blend of visceral, industrial influence production just simply goes way too hard. Number 33 goes to Joey Valance and Bray, No Hands. Directly contrasting the entry that comes before it, No Hands is just a mindless fun type of album, with the duo doing very little to hide their Beastie Boys influence. You know a bit of what you're getting into. This isn't just a copy-paste formula though, it's revivalism done right. They sprinkle in so much life and personality into the mix here while seeming to modernize and revitalize familiar sounds. At number 32, we're gonna do Machine Girl, MG Ultra. While staying firmly with their roots in digital hardcore, it feels like you could never quite know what to expect from Machine Girl. It seems like with their latest MG Ultra, they've opted to keep everyone on their toes even more, covering their widest array of sounds and styles yet. They seem to add elements of everything from nu metal to psychedelic to hyperpop to their typical mix that makes this an extremely diverse and refreshing listen that never comes across as directionless throughout it. Number 31, Nails, Every Bridge Burning. Another band that was on essentially no one's 2024 bingo card was Nails. But the grindcore legends have come through again with one of their most brutal listens yet. The 3 records they put out in the past have always felt like they gradually descend in quality, only slightly, but still somewhat noticeably, with Unsilent Death being the best. Every Bridge Burning feels like it's finally a step up from the one that came before it. It's the punishing, brutal nail sound in full devastating effect. Here at number 30, we have Poppy, Negative Spaces. Poppy is another artist to make good on nu metal influence this year, and that feels like the main focus of Negative Spaces sound. There's also some straight up pop songs, all of which sounding absolutely magical, and some harsh, heavy dives into metalcore that feel like she picked up a thing or two from her collaboration with Knocked Loose earlier in the year. Number 29 is going to be Lupe Fiasco, Samurai. Lupe has been respected for quite some time by hip-hop heads as being one of the best in lyrical, abstract, and conscious spaces of the genre. Samurai is just another reason that continues to be the case by being both a great display of lyricism and technical rapping ability. This album is also set to a charmingly and fittingly vintage sound, calling back to something feeling right at home in the 90s with artists like A Tribe Called Quest. Number 28 is going to go to Nala Sinefro, Endlessness. It feels like Jazz had a great run in 2024, and this record is one of the most creative entries in it, heavily incorporating space ambient elements. The raw instrumentation in the mix is certainly impressive, but when paired with some more digital, peaceful, sometimes trippy and surreal sounds, it becomes something indescribably beautiful. Number 27, we have Igloo Ghost, Title Memory EXO. This album cover has strong contender for my favorite album cover of the year, and the music on the album that accompanies it is just as cool. Also just as chaotic and unexplainable. In electronic music, this pushes as far as possible into pure, harsh, organized chaos. It moves like the pacing of the climax to a blockbuster thriller movie and only lets up to occasionally explore interestingly strange and vivid landscapes of sound. There's nothing quite like it, but if you're looking for an intense, one-of-a-kind listen, this is the way to go. Number 26 is going to go to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Wild God. The long-running and artistically impressive career of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds got its latest entry in 2024, and it's one that lives up to the rest of the catalog. This album is extremely creative, vivid in imagery, surreal, majestic, and conceptually consistent. Its fanciful Baroque pop and gospel-influenced moments make it a bit of a patient listen, but one that's ultimately very rewarding. Number 25, Molchat Doma, Balea Pelosa. This Belarusian gothic rock and new wave band are continuing their trajectory of making music that sounds like a recreation of those genres' roots while transcending the timeline entirely. The imagery of brutalist architecture over otherworldly terrain in the band's album artworks does a decent bit to describe the extraterrestrial aura they bring to these familiar soundscapes. Balea Pelosa is a record with such a unique, mysterious character that feels like it lives within a world that only the music can transport you to. Number 24, we're going to go with Parannoul, Sky 100. When it comes to picking out the best of the recent wave of artists revitalizing the shoegaze genre, Parannoul has been a consistently, easily justified pick. Since Parannoul's inception, they've been impressively, steadily prolific given the consistency and quality they've come with, and Sky 100 is simply the latest arguable masterpiece they've put out. This album particularly dives into the potentially nostalgic, warm, and comforting side of shoegaze. It feels to me like driving with the windows down as the leaves fall on a crisp, chilly, Autumn Evening. Number 23, Your Arms Are My Cocoon, Death of a Rabbit. Of the artists here, Your Arms Are My Cocoon might be the hardest to get into if you're not already somewhat familiar and accustomed to scrams, screamo, or any similarly harsh blends of hardcore music. But what they present on this debut might serve as a good place to start. If you're familiar with the noisy but bittersweet sounds of genres like indie-tronica, this might feel more at home than a harsher band like Orchid, for example. Whether or not you're into it, I find it pretty hard to argue the band is doing something significantly unique, creative, and captivating at an emotional level with this incredibly impressive debut album. Here at number 22, we have Porter Robinson's Smile. With this album and the one before it, Nurture, it feels almost impossible to imagine Porter Robinson came up on music that was pretty standard EDM for the time back in 2014. Nurture was clearly made with the intent of being an emotionally heavy listen, but Porter said that his intention when making Smile was initially to just make something fun rather than sincere, but eventually ended up falling into writing his true feelings anyways. That's exactly how Smile ends up sounding. The hooks are explosive, bombastic, and immediately lovable. The production is upbeat, but below all of that catchy likability is a strong, sincere message that comes from a pretty unique angle. Number 21, Billie Eilish, Hit Me Hard and Soft. Where Porter didn't necessarily set out to fuse poppy sounds with a more heartfelt sentiment, it seems that goal was immediately set when Billie Eilish went to make her latest album. There's fun to be had with the accessible, lighthearted tracks on the album such as Lunch or Birds of a Feather, but overall, this album harshly contrasts what you tend to hear from the biggest pop stars out there right now. The approach this album takes feels a lot more potently ambitious, and it's packed still into a pretty tight runtime. The sounds here aren't too dissimilar from her previous albums, but the artful manner in which the album was conceptualized and executed has left a far greater impact on me than her previous work. Alright, so now it's time to get into the top 20.
Only with these Grammys when it's all said and done, come on.
At the number 20 pick here, we have Tyler, the Creator's Chromacopia. Ever since his noticeable turning point in an artistic trajectory with Flower Boy, it's been consistently fair to assume a new Tyler, the Creator album will be one of the best and most notable releases of the year. Chromacopia feels like it really came out of nowhere, but still continued to prove that to be the case. It's probably his most varied album yet, at least in his modern era, and might not be as vulnerable as Igor, but certainly feels the most personal, which fits in well with the running mask metaphor in the lyrics. It's fantastically produced and absolutely wonderful on the ears, but if you've already heard those last three records, that might just come across as obvious. At number 19, we have Glass Beach, Plastic Death. It feels like in the more experimental lanes of rock this year, it was more held up by the underdogs, and Glass Beach kicked off the year right with their sophomore record. Plastic Death meets in the middle of fuzzy, lo-fi, indie rock, and complex, progressive, high-concept art rock to make something that sounds just as colorful as its cover. What's even better is that the writing here is pretty profoundly executed, and the album flows so well as a front-to-back experience. Now moving on to number 18. Here we have Violet Pony, Monarch of Monsters. Oddly enough, this album falls in a somewhat similar niche to the entry before it, and might be the even more intense, profound, and experimental of the two. This 83-minute narrative-led noise rock behemoth is a great reminder to never judge a book by its cover, because what's inside this book will prove shockingly impressive. Swan's comparisons have been made, and while that influence is pretty clear, it doesn't even start until you begin the biggest and boldest tracks on the album. Across its runtime, Monarch of Monsters explores numerous forms of rock music and carries a dark, sinister, frightening underlying energy to most of its entries. Then moving on to number 17. Here we have Auric Echo's Division for Human Ascension. Unintentionally, this is the third entry in a row going for more of an experimental rock direction, but what was intentional is recommending this one even higher than the last two. It shares similarities to the record before it in that it's a totally unique, intense, and sometimes frightening experience, and one that carries an underlying narrative with characters that you can follow through. Where it goes beyond that for me is that this is a more trimmed down runtime and manages to cover a similar amount of ground, incorporating so many vivid sounds and influences. The jazz elements remind me significantly of Black Midi, so I'd recommend this 2 times as much if you're already into that band. If you are or you aren't, go give this one a try because it is a wild ride. Then moving on to number 16.
Reincarnated, I was stargazing. Life goes on, I need her, my babies. Woke up looking for the broccoli.
Here we have Kendrick Lamar, GNX. While Chromacopia felt pretty unexpected, no album more suddenly and impactfully shook the world of hip-hop more than GNX did in 2024. Considering the feud he ultimately unanimously won by a landslide against Drake, this was already arguably Kendrick Lamar's craziest and best year, but GNX did an entire album of a victory lap to fully cement that. Whether it's linking back up with Mustard to follow up Not Like Us with similar West Coast style bangers that go just as hard, or collaborating with SZA to make catchy and widely likable poppier songs, this is another extremely solid entry in a near perfect discography. Then moving on to number 15. Yes, I do. Now moving on to number 14. At number 14, we have Blood Incantation, Absolute Elsewhere. Metal had its best year in a long time in 2024, and this Out of This World record is one of the biggest contributors to why I think that's the case. Blood Incantation, with their particularly notable blend of intergalactic death and thrash metal, have been missing from the world for half a decade since Hidden History of the Human Race, and there hasn't been too many metal albums on its level since the time that it released then. They've now picked the perfect time to come back at us with something even bigger, better, grander to make us transcend into the untold hellish celestial dimensions. And then at number 13,
She chose a junk over me and put my ass on the street. And since that day, your son been
Aller himself, Anything Helps, No Drugs. This is a pretty underground rapper coming out of Seattle with his first project, and listening to it, you'd never know that to be the case. This is a concept album that, in his words, tells the story of the fentanyl and homelessness crisis in Seattle from the perspective of those afflicted, and it is strikingly effective in execution. His skill on a storytelling and delivery level easily rivals some of the best out right now, making similar conscious hip-hop, and I'm shocked that something this good is just how he's starting out. He already has followed this project up too, and I'm calling it right now, there's going to be a lot of respect and recognition coming his way in the near future. Now moving on to number 12. Here we have Brat by Charlie XCX. This year in music will likely forever be associated most prominently with this record more than anything else, and there's good reason why. Brat shows us the very best in pop music by fitting impactful lyrical sentiment and significant creative experimentation in a package that's just as widely likable and listenable as the pop music that doesn't have those things. It's catchy, and the absolute bangers of tracks from it here are some of the most modern, memorable pop songs, but it's the heartfelt underlying moments that make it something truly amazing. This isn't a 10 out of 10 album for me, as it has slight missteps in certain styles or sounds, but it's a 10 out of 10 landmark moment in time, an easy contender for the best moment in music this year. Then moving on to number 11.
Check. Full moon rotating on the pinky. Half a roach packed with the sticky. These cats iffy.
Here we have Jesse the Tree, Not Fade Away. Much like 2 entries back, a rapper who's not yet getting the credit they deserve, but likely will be soon, is Jesse the Tree. This time around, it's usually a bit less serious though, because with a few exceptions that dive into something more personal and introspective, Not Fade Away is just such a fun album to listen to, and it's the album that I came back to the most this year for that reason. Jesse's flow and just overall presence as a rapper is just so smooth, charismatic, and likable. He's clever, he's relatable, and just makes some great vibes that this album consistently gives off. Said great vibes are then continued because this album has some vintage sounding, equally smooth production, making for some of the best music to just put on for the purpose of chilling to you'll find this year. Now getting into the top 10. Here we have U-Boa, Impossible Light. I remember Origin of My Depression being one of the first heavily experimental and super abrasive albums I listened to back in 2019, and it absolutely blew me away at the time. I never could have guessed that 5 years later, with much more experience in experimental music, I'd be having a similar, shocking, terrifying, and intense reaction to a U-Boa album. Origin of My Depression is by absolutely no means whatsoever a pleasant and easy listen, but the blend of industrial and ambient here is just truly the stuff of nightmares with how dark and disturbing it is. Impossible Light feels like a series of ominous false senses of security where everything appears calm but there's clearly something not quite right, giving way to intense, horrific, bone-chilling, violent, explosive moments. Not for the faint of heart is an understatement, even right down to the very serious subject matter the album deals in lyrically, but if you're up for it, it's a seriously impressive listen. Then moving on to number 9.
Let's get lit. Let the get got with.
Here we have Kamasi Washington, Fearless Movement. Both Luther and Squabble Up on GNX, which we already saw at number 16, interestingly have Kamasi Washington credited as a producer, but those tracks are nowhere near the full extent of what he came back with in 2024. That's because one of the biggest modern era legends in jazz is here with a diverse, expansive, massive, and predictably impressive masterpiece. There's a pretty regular amount of tracks here at 12, but an unordinarily long runtime of 86 minutes, and I can't say there's a minute wasted among them with how cinematic and immersive this album plays. Then moving on to number 8. Here we're going with The Cure's Songs for a Lost World. Between their 16-year gap in album releases and gradual downward trajectory in quality with the 4 albums they released before that gap, Songs for a Lost World has absolutely no right being as good as it is. I mean, really, who could have ever predicted the legends would be coming back nearly 5 decades deep in their career with an album so good you wouldn't be insane to call it their best? The pure, dramatic, theatrical maximalism of this record makes it sound pretty different from their most iconic classics, but there's still enough parallels to their gloomy gothic rock entries to feel similar and fitting in their discography. It's almost like they just pretended their 5-album alt-rock sounding streak never happened at all, and they're picking it up right where they left off with Disintegration. Rather than feeling like a sequel to that album though, this is more like a grandiose recollection and epilogue to it. It sounds like they might have more coming down the line here shortly, but if this does end up being The Cure's grand finale, it's a damn well-fitting one. Then moving on to number 7. Here we have Sam LRC, A Lonely Sinner. Despite a few well-established and unanimously respected acts dropping post-rock albums in 2024, somehow this relatively quite lesser-known artist ended up impressing me the most. The Godspeed You Black Emperor influence on this record ends up being pretty clear, so that might give you some insight as to where I would have placed that album. But even that band's influence in mind, I think I might prefer this album due to how dynamic it is. A Lonely Sinner goes through many different phases that range from calm and soothing to crushing and overwhelming overpowering. Beyond the post-rock bass core, there's elements of shoegaze making for beautifully transcendent ethereal moments. There's even stripped back acoustic singer-songwriter sections that add a level of vulnerability and relatability. Overall, I'm just simply blown away that a more or less independent and solo artist could put out a piece of post-rock this mesmerizing. It's not one to gloss over, and I can only imagine it'll mean great things to come from Sam Allercy in the future. We then move on to number 6.
If you count on me, baby, count twice. If you count on me, baby, count twice.
At this placement, we have James Blake and Lil Yachty, Bad Cameo. To emphasize just how great of a year 2024 was in music, just barely squeaking outside the top 5 is an album that would have been in the top 2 if it had come out in any year since 2018. While that might sound hyperbolic, especially considering some of the lukewarm sentiments this album has been surrounded by, I legitimately love Bad Cameo that much. Yachty's dive into psychedelic rock in 2023 was one of the most impressive redemption arcs in all of music, and as time passes, it looks more and more like a landmark album. I genuinely hold the sentiment this album is just a farther step forward into something equally trippy, equally intriguing, but more engaging and likable. I'll absolutely admit to some bias in just being a sucker for melodic and poppy forms of rap music, and seeing Yachty take that approach over such an entrancing and beautiful style and selection of instrumentals is just heaven to my ears. While he's naturally going to be the main focus of the two, James Blake's contributions to the album are equally valuable and really pack in some enormous emotional punch. This album feels like an experience that's equal parts bittersweet and refreshing every time I give it my full attention, but I've come back to it numerous times as music to just put on as I go throughout my day, just because I like how it sounds as much as I do. Now getting into the top 5, but before we do, we have to do a quick little 5.5. And that's going to be Shoo Shoo's 13-inch Frank Beltrame Italian stiletto with bison horn grips. I think I got it all right, even if I didn't. This album is fantastic, and it was supposed to get in the top 5, but somehow I missed it. I have more recent things on the list, so I'm not sure why I didn't end up adding this too. I definitely started the list, like started putting it together before it came out, but I guess I just missed this one. It was supposed to be on the list, and not only was it supposed to be on the list, it was supposed to be around the top 5 spot here, so we've just went ahead and plopped it in right here. But this sees Shoo Shoo at their most accessible, but their most accessible is still pretty crazy. It does make for some of the band's most replayable songs, like Beneficium and Common Loon. There's some pretty regular rock elements that just kind of come into the mix and make it for just a really pleasant listening experience, but that's only if you're really accustomed to their already really high barrier to entry. Forever might be a slightly more relaxed album, even though that one also has its really crazy moments, but it's like a mental breakdown of an album, but a kind of pleasant mental breakdown of an album. It's one of the most creative things I've heard all year, but also one of the most replayable of the very experimental albums on the list. So definitely had to put it in here real quick, but yeah, I unfortunately have to just butcher the video a little bit real quick here. Now getting into the top 5 with our number 5 pick.
Man, fuck being depressed, asbestos. I don't like people. I don't like people.
This one's going to go to Blade, Cold Visions. 2024 saw Blade dropping this album, an incredible collab album with Young Lean that I was certain would be in my top 20 before this dropped, and finally, what was probably his biggest moment of exposure ever, collaborating with Charlie XCX on a remix of her song Rewind. Maybe it's a hot take that 2024 was Blade's greatest year ever, but I don't really think it should be. The aesthetic and genre of Cold Visions is very interesting to look at because at a surface glance, it looks like Blade is just hopping on the rage wave that's been very trendy in mainstream rap, when realistically, it's more like rage artists are hopping on Blade's wave because he's been working working with Filthy since 2017, and Filthy was a producer that was a big part of Whole Lotta Red's sound, which is essentially the album that's easily the biggest reason the genre is even a thing. Extremely niche recent history lesson aside, moral of the story is that Cold Visions is a blend of Blade's typical frigid, spacey, and of course drained sound with the rage trap sound that has become so popular in recent years. And the results are honestly so immaculate. These quirked out sounds fit each other like a fucking glove, and it's simply insane how well it works out in harmony. The track list is 30 songs long, and I've genuinely jumped in and spun all 30 in consecutive order numerous times since this has dropped. There's simply no other portal that exists to enter this strange, mysterious universe. Strap the headphones on tight and jump in head first. Then we're moving on to the number 4 spot. Here we have Jack Name, Fabulous Soundtracks. Just to reiterate again how great this year was for music, this is the first of 4 albums that I gave a perfect score to this year. Naturally, due to that fact, I've now several times had to try and mostly fail to describe Jack Name's incredibly unique sound. I think that's just because the thing that rings to me so incredibly exceptional about it is something that's pretty entirely indescribable. I could throw genre tags and descriptors at you all day like folk rock and neo-psychedelia, but at the end of the day, all I can say is that this album is something so singularly mysterious, it doesn't entirely feel like it's from this plane of existence. I'll also say it's a listen overall that is deeply deserving of your ear's attention. Then moving on to our number 3 spot. We have Knocked Loose. While Blood Incantation was one of the biggest reasons metal had its greatest year in ages, Knocked Loose rings to me as inarguably the biggest reason that's the case. This album truly takes the darkest, heaviest, and most brutal sounds metalcore has to offer and pushes them to their farthest, cleanest level of perfect execution. If you can make music that sounds as harsh and aggressive as what you just heard in that clip, and take that to the heights of popularity so high you're landing a spot on Jimmy Kimmel's show and scaring the audience, you're doing something right. Naturally, throughout the time since this dropped, there's been steadily a growing swarm of hardcore gatekeepers that are mad someone in their scene actually got popular and successful. Honestly, seeing Knocked Loose fly so high they have no reason to care is extremely gratifying. As far as I'm concerned, this is both the best record to expand your taste into heavier music if you haven't already, and it's the best sounding thing those of us who already appreciated heavier music have heard in probably decades now. It's a clean and precise execution of pure, unfiltered, raw, destructive anger that put my jaw on the floor the first time I heard it and still blows me away with every re-listen. And then we'll move on to number 2.
Just make it make sense to me. Yeah, am I so much of a stain to you? Mistake to you?
Just one short of the year's top spot, we have Mavi, Shadowbox. If this list has been any indication, another genre that had a great year, albeit a much more low-key year, was abstract hip-hop. The biggest standout in that niche has got to be Mavi, based on his latest record here, and I don't think the competition is even slightly steep with that. Of course, lyricism is something exceptionally important when considering music like this, and Mavi has got to be my favorite lyricist out there right now. Every line on Shadowbox reads to me like pure, perfect, gorgeous poetry. It's the sort of thing that reads as brutally personal and genuine, which is incredible when considering how few lines are literal and how deeply intertwined in imagery and metaphor the whole album is. Lyricism is only one aspect to judge this album on, but it's not the only standard that I would consider it perfect on. The instrumentals on this album are so incredibly beautiful and immediately captivating that when I press play on most tracks here, I end up finding myself in a daze just fully, incredibly immersed in the sounds. Mavi's flow and delivery aren't his most unique attributes by far, mostly because there's comparisons I can actually make, but even then, there's really nothing I'd ever change. As far as any introspective forms of hip-hop go, especially any that lean in a more experimental direction, this album is absolutely untouchable in its level of quality as far as I'm concerned. And finally, moving on to the number 1 spot.
The world famous actor, still completely unknown, like the German Black Forest.
It's Jordy Griep, The New Sound. Perfect album is perfect. Music 2 just dropped, and it lives up to the original concept of music, but they skipped all the bad parts. Honestly, at this point, what more is there to say? Well, I'll try my best, and to start off, this album lives up to the hype. And it's in a way that I never really could have prepared for and didn't expect it to. Seeing Black Midi unceremoniously and suddenly break up this summer was so rough, given they've consistently been one of my favorite bands since their inception. I can't say I ever would have been upset to see that conclusion if I knew just how much it meant the band's frontman, Jordy Griep, would go on to spread his wings and soar to new levels mere months later. It's never been more clear how much of a major weight Griep must have had in the band's creative process, because this honestly feels like a contender for the greatest Black Midi album, despite not even being a Black Midi album. Even the album's longest, boldest, arguably best track, The Magician, had become a staple at their live show. They unfortunately weren't playing it yet back when I saw them, and I can only hope one day to see Griep playing the exquisite, majestic theatrical piece of music that it is. All of those descriptors and more apply consistently to the incredible tracks on The New Sound and the wonderfully strange narrative that it follows. I feel like I could say an entire novel's length worth of yapping on the wonderful intricacies of The New Sound, but if you found your way onto this video, you've probably already heard it by now anyways. If you somehow love music and still missed out on this one, please click off this video right now, because your ears have better places to be. That concludes it and wraps it all up for music in 2024. Really hoping this gets out by the end of the year. It should. Sorry if the mic in my face was distracting for the whole video, but I decided to try my best to counter the background noise that I have been battling with in this apartment. We do have new music podcast episodes up covering the best and worst music of 2024, and I also have a list out now on the best songs, the worst songs, and the worst albums, all of which came out before this one. But if you have liked what you've seen here today, dropping a like on the video would be greatly appreciated, as would be subscribing to the channel and turning notifications on for more music-related content coming your way. But that's just about going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you next year.